The Scythian civilization existed in the Ukrainian steppe long before anyone learned to call these lands a borderland or an emptiness. And for the Scythians themselves, this space was not boundless in our sense, because it had structure, directions, rules, and limits that were not marked by stone or walls, yet were known to everyone who was born and grew up here amid the movement of camps, horses, and people connected not by chance, but by a shared order of life. The Scythians did not appear here suddenly and did not arrive from outside as strangers. They became part of this space so deeply that the steppe ceased to be a backdrop and turned into an environment in which everything from the way one ate to the way one buried the dead was subordinated to a single rhythm. And this rhythm sustained a civilization without the need for cities, palaces, or written laws. Their life was built around the clan, and the clan was not merely a family because it included the living, the dead, and those not yet born, and therefore every decision, whether to go on a campaign, change a camp, or conclude an alliance, was regarded not as a personal choice, but as an action affecting a long chain of existence that does not break with the death of an individual. In this world, power was not separated from everyday life because the ruler did not sit in a distant center but moved together with everyone, ate the same food, slept in the same cold, and took the same risks as others. Yet his status was unquestionable because it was confirmed not by words but by signs that not everyone had the right to wear. And these signs were visible not only in grand forms, but also in small details, in the heavy neck torque that lay on the collarbones as if locking a roll into place, in the plates on the belt that held not only the strap, but also the right itself, in the fittings on the bow case that immediately said that before you stood not merely a mounted warrior with a weapon, but a person whose status had already withstood proof through action. It is precisely here that gold appears, not as wealth, but as a language through which the civilization fixed power, transition, and memory. Because gold does not age, does not darken, and does not lose its form, and therefore is capable of preserving meaning when everything else disappears or changes. And for that reason, it entered not into everyday necessity, but into those moments when order had to be sacre pleno, so that time could not erase it. Golden objects did not accompany every Scythian. They were not part of daily use and were not passed on without reason, because every object carried meaning, and this meaning was understood without explanation. Who had the right to lead, who had the right to speak, who had the right to make the final decision, and who had the right to be heard. And therefore even a small golden plaque sewn onto clothing could function as a quiet yet indisputable sign of belonging, recognized by one's own and respected by outsiders without asking why. The craftsmen who worked with gold were not a separate caste detached from life, because they knew well for whom and for what purpose they created their objects, and every line they struck into a thin sheet of metal corresponded not to imagination, but to precise knowledge of how strength, movement, and tension look in a world where life constantly balances between departure and return. And that is why the images on gold were not ornament, but a language of roles that required no letters. Thus, animals appeared on gold, not as decorations and not as depictions of the surrounding world, but as codes, in which the deer meant speed and the path, the panther meant a sudden strike and danger, the griffin meant the guarding of a boundary between different states of being, and these images required no interpretation because they were part of a shared language understood by everyone within this civilization. And this language could tell no less than writing, sometimes through a single curve of a horn, the tension of a paw, or the grip of teeth. It explained what a person must hold within themselves. A warrior who wore such a sign did not adorn himself, he carried responsibility. because gold did not allow one to hide behind words or avoid action, and whoever had the right to wear these objects also had the obligation to confirm their status through deeds rather than speech. And therefore gold in the Scythian world was closer to a seal than to a jewel. The life of the Scythians was not an unbroken war, but war was always present as a possibility. And for that reason, every man from childhood learned to wield weapons, stay in the saddle, and act in formation, where not personal bravery, but coordination of movement mattered, because the strength of the steppe civilization rested not on individual heroes, but on the ability to act together. And it is here that it becomes clear why the bow and arrow case, the goritas, could bear a golden fitting with scenes that were not merely beautiful, but disciplined the gaze, because this object was seen every day, and every day it reminded of the norm. The horse in this world was not property in our sense, because it was part of a person's life from early years, and between rider and horse existed a bond that required no explanation, and it was precisely this bond that allowed the Scythians to move swiftly, cover great distances, and maintain control over space without the need for fortified cities. And golden details on the harness, when they appeared, spoke not of the beauty of the horse, but of the fact that together with this horse moved someone's role and someone's responsibility. Scythian daily life was simple and precise, because everything superfluous in the steppe quickly becomes a burden, and food, clothing, and tools had to be reliable, clear, and tested. And this simplicity did not prevent the complexity of their worldview, in which every action had meaning and every gesture could be part of a ritual. And golden objects in such a life were not luxurious, but exact. They appeared where it was necessary to fix the boundary between mere living and a moment of transition. When the hour of calm came in the camp, people did not tell stories for entertainment, because their life itself was a story that everyone knew well, and words sounded only when it was necessary to fix something, remind, or pass it on. And in these conversations, there was no invention, because invention had no value where everything was decided by deed. And the gold that lay silently beside a person of status already spoke by the mere fact of its presence. Here is an order that lasts longer than a single night. A special place in Scythian life occupied transitions between states, coming of age, acceptance of warrior status, entry into the circle of elders, and each of these moments was accompanied by actions that were not explained in words, because their meaning was obvious to those who had grown up in this culture, and therefore the sign that appeared on the body was not a gift, but a fixation of a new place within the system. Death in the Scythian world was perceived not as disappearance, but a person considered part of an order that does not break, and therefore preparation for departure was carried out as carefully as preparation for a long campaign, gathering everything necessary not for the body, but for the status that a person retained even after death. And that is why gold in burial was not wealth, but a form that survives decay and holds a role when organic matter vanishes. And thus kurgans appeared, not as signs of mourning and not as monuments, but as places where life was fixed in a form capable of surviving time. And each kurgan was a continuation of power, not its end. Inside the kurgan, everything was arranged not by chance, because weapons, horse gear, vessels, and gold formed a single system reflecting a person's place in the world. And it was precisely gold in this system that served as the material preserving the form of order when organic matter vanished. And therefore large compositions, such as pectorals with several tiers of scenes, were read as a compressed model of the world, where the upper level shows human order, the middle shows the movement of forces and animals, and the lower shows the boundary and the guarding of what cannot be violated without consequences.
The Kurgan did not close history, but opened it to those who knew how to read these signs. And for the Scythians themselves, it remained a point of memory past which one did not pass indifferently, because everyone knew here lies a person whose path did not end, but merely changed direction. Thus, in the steppe existed a civilization without writing, but with precise memory, without cities, but with centers of power, without stone temples, but with rituals that required no walls. And gold in this civilization was not a theme and not a goal, but proof that the order created by people can outlive the people themselves.
The life of the Scythian civilization was not reduced to campaigns and burials, because between these extreme points lay a long, saturated, everyday existence, within which people's character was formed and order was maintained. And it was precisely in this everyday life that gold acquired its true meaning, not as a rare metal, but as the completion of a long chain of actions, decisions, and trials, when a sign is not invented, but earned, and when a form worn on the body becomes the language of reputation that no longer needs to be proven by words. A camp never arose by chance, because a place for it was chosen with regard to water, wind, visibility, and the memory of the land. And when the tents formed a circle, this was done not for convenience, but to preserve an inner space where everyone knew their place and needed no separate command to take it. And where a person's place is defined, a sign is read more precisely because it enters the structure of the day rather than hanging on accident. At the center of such a circle, there was always a hearth, but it was not a symbol in our sense, because fire here performed a practical role, to cook food, dry clothing, warm hands, and at the same time served as the point around which the rhythm of the day was aligned, for it was near it that people gathered when the hour came to speak, listen, or be silent together. And it was precisely here that one could see that certain objects appeared only at the right moment, a cup taken out not every day, or a small golden detail that passed from hand to hand, not as a gift, but as confirmation that what was said had already become part of the order. The food of the Scythians was simple but nourishing, because in the steppe it was not variety that was valued, but reliability, and meat, milk, and grain, gathered or exchanged, gave the strength to move on without being tied to one place, yet without breaking away from familiar roots, which were passed down from generation to generation as precisely as clan signs. And therefore the belt on which a knife or tool hung also became a bearer of writing, because it was on the belt that metal plates often appeared, repeating a single motive many times, like a rhythm that keeps a person within the boundaries of their role. Exchange in the Scythian world did not look like trade in our sense, because it rarely came down to calculation, and reputation mattered more than quantity, for a person who once broke their word lost more than they could gain through any deception. And precisely for this reason, ties between clans and tribes remained strong, even when they stretched across great distances, and objects that came from other worlds did not break the Scythian language of signs, but either fit into it or remained foreign, and then they were not hastened to be made own. Gold almost never appeared in these exchanges because it was not used as payment, and it remained within the sphere of power, ritual, and memory, while other materials sufficed for everyday life. And this once again emphasized that Scythian gold was not accidental or excessive, but appeared only when it was truly necessary. And precisely for this reason, small golden plaques sewn on clothing worked not as coins, but as markers of status that do not pass in exchange, but hold a person in their place. The craftsman who worked with metal did not sit apart from life, because he saw warriors, heard the decisions of elders, and knew who had the right to wear a particular sign, and therefore his work was not separated from reality, but on the contrary was its continuation, fixed in a form that outlived a person. And that is why the most common golden words of this civilization were often small,
a plate, a plaque, a fitting, but there could be many of them, and together they created a coherent image of a person who could be seen from afar as part of the order. When he chose an image, he did not seek inspiration, because the images were known in advance, and each animal had its place in the shared understanding of the world, where the deer meant the path and ability to cover distance, the bird meant connection between levels, the predator meant a force that cannot be stopped, and these meanings did not change from generation to generation because they were tested by life itself. And therefore the image on a plaque or buckle was not a drawing, but a short message about which force a person must hold and which boundary they have no right to cross. Golden objects were not made in advance and did not wait for an owner, because each object had to correspond to a specific person and a specific role, and therefore there were few such objects, but each of them was precise, like an answer to a question that is not asked aloud, and thus a bow case with a relief fitting or a belt with a set of plates spoke not in general about the Scythians, but about a particular person within their order. When a warrior received the right to wear such a sign, it meant that he had already passed a path invisible from the outside and had proven his ability to act not only for himself but for the clan. And from that moment his name could be forgotten, but the sign remained, because it belonged not to the person, but to the order that he represented. Women in the Scythian civilization were not separated from this order, because they too belonged to the clan and had their own status, and their role was not reduced to home or camp, for it was through them that continuity, memory, and rite were transmitted. And therefore female burials often contained signs of power, weapons, and gold, which testified to their real place within the structure of society. And precisely for this reason, a woman's ornament could be not lighter, but authoritative, one that spoke of the lineage of the clan rather than of taste. From early years, children grew up amid movement and action, and for them the world was not a mystery, because everything necessary was before their eyes: how to hold a horse, how to listen to elders, how not to violate boundaries, and it was in this way that a person was formed who needed no explanations, because he lived in a system where everything had its purpose, and where even a small sign on clothing, a plaque with a deer or a bird, could be the first language a child read, even before learning to understand the distant conversations of elders. When the time came for a great gathering, rare but important, the camps moved closer together, and then the space filled with voices, movement, and smells. But even in such moments, there was no chaos, because everyone knew why they were there, and the decisions that were made were not impulsive, but inscribed into the long memory of the civilization. And it was precisely here that gold could appear, not as display, but as final fixation, a sign that silently confirmed what was said would not fly away, because it now had form. It was at such gatherings that questions of campaigns, alliances, or transitions could be decided, and it was here that gold could appear again, not as decoration, but as a sign of sealing an agreement, remaining when words had already flown away with the wind. Thus, the Scythian civilization existed not as a collection of separate individuals, but as a living organism in which each part knew its function, and gold in this organism played the role of bone, hard, unchanging, capable of preserving form when everything else yields to time. And while the camps once again dispersed along their paths and horses raised dust over the plain, order did not disappear, because it was not tied to a single place, and it was precisely for this reason the Scythian world could endure for centuries, leaving behind not ruins, but signs that even today allowed to feel that here existed a civilization capable of living without stone, but not without meaning.
Ritual in the Scythian world was not separated from life, because life itself was a sequence of actions in which every step carried meaning. And for this very reason, there was no clear boundary between the everyday and the sacred. since any action performed correctly was already part of the order that maintained balance between people, clan, and the world they lived in. And gold did not stand aside from this, because it entered precisely those actions where balance needed to be remembered for a long time. When the hour of purification came, it did not look solemn or mysterious in our sense, because the Scythians did not need spectacle, and everything happened calmly, without unnecessary movements, within a circle of those who had the right to be present. And there were no accidental people in this circle, because accident in such matters meant violation, and violation could have consequences no one desired. And for this reason, the objects brought into the circle had weight, not beauty. And if a gold detail appeared beside a cauldron or a cup, it meant that a transition was being fixed now, not that an action was simply taking place. Fire here was not a symbol, because it was a tool, and in the cauldrons boiled not merely drinks or food, but mixtures with a concrete purpose, to cleanse body and mind before an important action, a campaign, or a passage. And everyone knew when and how much could be taken, because excess in such matters was just as dangerous as deficiency. And for this reason, ritual vessels, a cup, a fiale, a rhyton, became not beautiful objects, but places where agreement moved from voice into memory. And gold on such items, if it was present, worked as confirmation that the act could no longer be reversed. These rituals did not teach and did not explain, they included. Because a person who passed through them did not become someone else, they simply took their place. And for this reason, after purification, they did not speak much, did not sum things up, and did not try to fix anything in words, because it was enough that all those present had seen and remembered, and what needed to be preserved longer than the memory of one generation was preserved in form, in metal, in image, in a repeating motif. In such moments, the presence of the elders was felt especially strongly, not as overseers, but as bearers of memory, because they knew the order of actions that had not changed for decades, and each of their silences was more important than any speech, since silence meant agreement that everything was happening correctly. And if on the body of the person leading the rite or making the decision there was a sign of gold, this sign did not say, "I am rich," but "I am responsible," and therefore it was seen and accepted without unnecessary questions. After rituals, feasts often followed, but they were not celebrations in our sense, because they had no aim to entertain or impress, and food, drink, and conversation served another function, to secure unity, to remind of mutual obligations, and to allow people to see one another in a calm state, when there was no need to act quickly. And it is precisely here that it becomes clear why scenes of shared drinking or sealed agreement, when they appeared on gold plates or ornaments, were not illustrations, but signs that alliance rests on action, not on speech. At such tables, matters were not decided hastily, and decisions matured not in argument, but in observation, because the Scythians knew the price of words and preferred actions, and for this reason agreements concluded after a feast were considered stronger than those born in tension. Gold could appear here as well, but not as decoration of the table and not as an object of exchange, but as a sign of completion, when a decision had already been made and did not require return. And in such moments, a golden object passed from one person to another, not as a gift, but as confirmation that the word had become part of the order, and that from now on it had a form that could not be torn apart by a single impulse. Blood brotherhood, which would later be spoken of as exotic, in reality was not a romantic gesture, because it meant taking responsibility not only for another's life, but also for the consequences of their decisions. And for this reason, one did not come to such a step quickly, but prepared for it longer,
making sure that the bond would withstand more than one campaign and more than one loss. And precisely for this reason, the signs that could accompany such a union were not accidental, because an accidental sign would not withstand the weight of another person's fate. After such a union, people ceased to be separate units, and this was felt not in words but in actions, in how they stood side by side, how they looked in the same direction, and how they made decisions without the need to consult each time, because their paths merged into one, and this bond was considered stronger than kinship. It was for such bonds that special signs were created, and here again gold fulfilled its role, because it did not decay with time and could preserve the form of this union even when one of its participants was no longer among the living, and therefore the image on gold was not a picture, but a knot of memory that does not undo. When someone left life, rituals did not change, because order did not adapt to emotion, and grief was not expressed loudly, for it was believed that excessive displays disrupted the path of the one who was crossing, and therefore everything was done restrainedly, but precisely, with attention to every detail. The body was prepared not for farewell, but for the road, and every object placed beside it had practical meaning in another state of being, and gold among these objects was not a sign of wealth, because wealth remained among the living, but a sign that the person departed with the same status they had in life, and that their role was not erased by the earth, but preserved by a form that outlived time. The horse that accompanied the person was prepared separately, and this was done without pity and without doubt, because it was believed that the path must be complete, and to leave a warrior without a horse would mean condemning them to an incomplete existence after the crossing, and order did not allow this. When the burial mound was raised, it was a communal task, and the earth rose slowly, layer by layer, as if the world itself were helping to fix memory. And in that moment there was no sense of loss, because everyone knew that life continued in another form, and the mound became the point where these forms intersect. After the rite was completed, life did not stop. The camp moved on, but the mound remained, and everyone who later passed by it knew that concentrated here was a force that did not need guarding, because it was guarded by the order itself laid into the earth. Thus, ritual, gold, and life were woven into a single fabric in which there was no place for accident, and it was this fabric that allowed the Scythian civilization to preserve integrity in a space that to others appeared chaotic and dangerous. And the longer this life lasted, the stronger became the bond between the living and those who had already crossed, because the mounds did not distance the past, but made it present, and gold in this presence did not shine, but held the form of memory that does not require words.
Power in the Scythian world was not an abstraction and did not exist separately from life, because it was not concentrated in one place and was not transmitted through a sign or inscription, but rested on recognition, which does not arise suddenly and cannot be imposed by force without confirmation through action. And for this very reason, a ruler in this civilization could not be separated from the path along which all others moved. The elder recognized as elder was not necessarily the oldest by age, because what mattered more was how many times he had proven his ability to hold order in difficult situations, how he behaved during a campaign, how he made decisions when circumstances changed, and whether he could not only command but also take responsibility for the consequences of what occurred. Power was not reduced to commands, because most decisions in the Scythian environment did not require words, and if the ruler took a step forward, others understood that it was time to act, and if he stopped, it meant that haste could destroy what had been built over a long time. And it was precisely this ability to sense the moment that made him the figure around whom a clan or a union of clans held together. Gold, in such cases, appeared not as a ruler's ornament, but as a sign of his role, because not everyone had the right to wear the same objects, and the difference between a person who is merely strong and a person who leads others was understood without explanation, since a sign on the body meant an obligation that could not be removed together with the ornament, and therefore a neck torque, a belt set, a chest sign, or a detail on a weapon were not status items, but a language of legitimacy that was seen and recognized. When several clans came together, this was not a random gathering, because such unions matured over a long time, and each step toward them was accompanied by tests, joint actions, and trials, in which people learned about one another not through words, but through how they behaved when tension increased and simple solutions did not exist. In such moments, the space of the steppe changed, because where separate camps had stood only yesterday, a common zone appeared, where movement became denser, voices more concentrated, and decisions heavier. And it was precisely here that the Scythian civilization revealed itself not as a collection of separate clans, but as a single organism capable of coordinated action. Contacts with other worlds were not unusual for the Scythians, because their roots intersected with many peoples, and these encounters were not always hostile or commercial in our sense, because exchange took place not only in objects, but also in ideas about order, strength, and right. When outsiders came into the steppe, they immediately felt the difference, because there were no stone buildings defining a center, yet there was a sense of structure that did not disappear even in movement, and this often surprised those accustomed to cities and borders, because the Scythian world had no boundaries that could be drawn, but had boundaries that could not be violated without consequences. Gold played a special role in these contacts because it could be understood by anyone regardless of language, and at the same time remained a bearer of inner meaning accessible only to those who knew the context. And for this reason, Scythian gold objects could inspire admiration, but did not always allow one to understand what they truly meant, because the outsider sees brilliance and technique, while the insider reads role and boundary. For the Scythians themselves, this was not a problem, because they did not need to explain themselves to the outside world, and the Scythian civilization did not seek recognition or imitation. It simply existed in its own rhythm, taking from contacts only what did not destroy its inner balance. Great unions arose when the situation required them and disappeared when the need passed, but memory of them remained, because each such period was woven into the overall history, remembered not by dates, but by events that changed the direction of movement. Rulers who led these unions did not try to inscribe their names, because their goal lay not in personal glory, but in preserving order, and for this reason, after their departure, no inscriptions remained, but burial mounds did, where every detail testified to the scale of a person without naming them. In such mounds, gold acquired special weight because it fixed not a single event, but an entire period, and one who later saw these objects could feel not only the mastery of execution, but also the tension of the time in which they were created. And if a chest ornament has 3 tiers of scenes, these tiers are not for beauty, but to preserve in form an idea of world order that the ruler was meant to hold.
The Scythian civilization did not seek to stop time because it knew very well that stopping meant decline, and therefore its strength lay in movement that did not destroy structure but sustained it, allowing change without losing itself. And it was precisely in this ability to combine movement and order that the uniqueness of a world lay, where gold was not a goal but a consequence, where power was not separated from life, and where civilization existed without stone, but with a memory capable of outlasting any material.
War for the Scythian civilization was neither a celebration nor a tragedy, because it was perceived as one of the forms of existence of order, in which not only the strength of an individual was tested, but the ability of the entire world to preserve balance under pressure. And for this very reason, war was not prepared for as an exception, but life was lived as if it could begin at any moment, without disturbing the familiar course of existence. Every warrior knew that his strength was not in a single strike, but in movement together with others. And therefore, from an early age, people were taught not only to wield weapons, but to feel tempo, distance, and the moment when one must act and when one must retreat, because the steppe does not forgive chaotic decisions and always returns mistakes to those who do not know how to wait. Scythian tactics were not based on direct confrontation because they understood well the cost of losses, and instead of breaking force against force, they preferred movement, maneuver, and exhaustion, in which the decisive factor was not the first blow, but the ability to preserve form when the opponent began to lose coherence. The horse in this war was not merely a means of transportation, but part of the tactic, because it allowed the Scythians to appear where they were not expected and to disappear before the enemy had time to understand what had happened. And this unpredictability was not accidental, but the result of long training and deep knowledge of the space in which they lived. And for this reason, horse harness, when marked with metal, could carry not an ornament, but a sign of belonging to a specific circle, so that in motion it was visible who moved at the front and who was responsible for the tempo. Scythian weapons were not distinguished by excessive complexity, because in the steppe what was valued was that which always worked, and the bow, spear, and short sword were extensions of the body, not objects for display. And for this reason, a warrior did not decorate his weapon without need, because any extra element could interfere at a decisive moment. But if a gold fitting appeared on the goritus or on elements of equipment, it was not an excess, but a sign read instantly, one that reminded the bearer of discipline and reminded others of his role. Gold in this context did not disappear, but neither did it stand on display, because it did not belong to the instruments of combat, but to the signs that determined who had the right to lead the unit, who was responsible for decisions, and who would bear responsibility if something went wrong. Before a campaign, no speeches were delivered, because unnecessary words were considered a waste of strength, and everything essential was already known, since the route, the goal, and the order of action were discussed in advance, and at the moment of departure, all that remained was to act, without looking back and without doubt. A campaign did not break the life of the camp, because the camp knew how to exist in waiting, and women, elders, and children continued their rhythm, knowing that return was no less important than departure. And for this reason, no one tried to speed up time or interfere with what had already been set in motion. When the detachment returned, this was not always accompanied by joy, because the outcome could be different, but order remained unchanged, and each warrior took his place, neither demanding reward nor making excuses, because evaluation did not occur immediately, but over time, in the memory of the clan. Trophies did not become objects of pride, because they were only proof of a completed action,
and gold among them again occupied a special place because it could be melted down, transformed into a new sign, or passed further on, changing form but preserving meaning. And it is precisely here that one sees that gold among the Scythians did not accumulate but worked, becoming part of a language that had to correspond to their order. Defeat in the Scythian world did not mean the end, because it was regarded as a disruption of balance that had to be corrected. And for this reason, even after heavy losses, the civilization did not collapse, but found new ways to preserve integrity, changing tactics, alliances, or direction of movement. Warriors who had survived many campaigns did not boast of their experience because it was already visible in their movements, glances, and silence. And it was precisely these people who later became those listened to when the time came to make decisions that went beyond a single battle. Thus, war was woven into the life of the Scythian civilization, not as a destructive force, but as a trial that allowed the strength of order to be tested again and again. And gold in this system remained outside the battle, but not outside meaning, fixing those moments when force passed into power and action into memory. And while the detachment disappeared into the distance and dust slowly settled over the plain, life did not stop, because the Scythian world was built so that movement did not destroy it, but sustained it, allowing the civilization to endure where other worlds crumbled under their own weight. Contacts with the world beyond the steppe did not destroy the Scythian civilization because it was not closed, and the paths along which camps and detachments moved inevitably led to encounters with those who lived differently, who built in stone, wrote on clay, and believed that the world could be ordered through the city rather than through movement. These encounters did not begin with hostility because the Scythians did not see a threat in the mere presence of another, and the first thing they evaluated was not words, but behavior, the ability to hold oneself, the understanding of boundaries, and the ability to wait, because patience was considered a sign of strength rather than weakness. Those who came from the direction of the sea brought other things, vessels, fabrics, wine, and these objects did not arouse envy, because the Scythians did not seek to possess everything. They took only what could fit into their order and left the rest without regret, seeing no loss in this. And it was precisely here that gold became a meeting place of two logics, because for the urban world it often meant value and craftsmanship, while for the steppe it meant role and boundary. And therefore the same object could be beautiful to an outsider and obligatory to one of their own. Exchange was not hurried, and it did not come down to calculation, because the stability of the connection mattered more than quantity. And for this reason, the same road could function for decades, changing people, but preserving a rhythm in which both sides knew what to expect and what should not be demanded. For outsiders, the Scythian world looked strange because it had no center that could be seized, no walls that could be destroyed, and no ruler who could be removed to break the system. And this often confused those who thought in terms of cities and borders. The Scythians, for their part, looked at these cities as something heavy and slow, because stone, which provides protection, at the same time deprives one of movement. And they understood well that a world unable to change its form sooner or later breaks under its own weight. Gold in these contacts acquired a new dimension because it could be understood by both sides, yet the meaning invested in it by the Scythians remained internal. And even when an outsider admired the mastery of execution, they did not always realize that before them was not an ornament, but a sign that carried obligation and memory. And for this reason, large objects created on the boundary of two worlds often bear scenes in which Scythians are shown within their own order,
as if someone were trying to translate the language of the steppe into a form understandable to the city, but in such a way that the meaning would not fall apart. Foreign craftsmen sometimes attempted to imitate these forms, and objects appeared that were similar on the outside but empty within, because they copied the line without understanding the movement. And it was precisely here that the difference became obvious to those who knew, because a true sign needed no explanation, while a counterfeit demanded commentary. Scythian craftsmen could adopt certain techniques, but they never changed the language of images, because it was connected not to fashion, but to a worldview in which the animal is not a decorative motif, but a form of force that accompanies a person in life and after it. Thus, in gold, there appeared objects that combined different traditions without losing their Scythian essence. And these items did not disrupt order, but on the contrary confirmed its ability to absorb the new without losing itself. Encounters with the outside world did not change the daily life of the camp, because it remained precise and restrained. And even when unfamiliar objects or words appeared nearby, they did not displace old habits, but simply took their allotted place, no more and no less. The Scythian world did not seek to become part of another civilization because it was already whole, and for this very reason contacts did not lead to dissolution, but only to an expansion of ideas about what the world beyond the steppe could be. For the Scythians themselves, these encounters were a reminder that their way of life was not the only possible one, but neither was it weak, and that the movement they had chosen allowed balance to be preserved, where others were forced to build and rebuild constantly. And while caravans once again departed toward the sea, and camps returned to their familiar rhythm, order was not disturbed, because it did not depend on external influences. And gold, which sometimes changed its form, remained the same sign that held the memory of a civilization that knew who it was and did not need external confirmation.
And yet any memory, even one made of gold, has a single vulnerability, because it lies beneath the ground and cannot bring itself into the light. And therefore, sooner or later, a person appears who, for the first time, sees in an ordinary mound not part of the landscape, but a frozen trace of another order. And then the Kurgan ceases to be merely an elevation on the horizon and becomes an entrance into a world where everything was arranged not for us, but nevertheless in order to endure. The point is not that someone came in search of treasure, because Scythian gold almost never lies in a way that allows it to be taken without understanding. It is hidden not only by earth, but by logic, within which objects are not scattered, but assembled into a system. And this system begins already on the surface, when you look at the Kurgan and suddenly notice that it has not natural randomness, but human intention. The form holds evenly. The slope rises as if it were piled layer by layer, not in haste, but with the thought that this mound must outlive generations. And even the grass grows differently on it, because the soil here is mixed and compacted, and beneath it lies not emptiness, but a sealed space, once closed, as if placing a final period in the story of a person who could not be forgotten within the clan. When the earth begins to open, the first thing that appears is not gold, and not even mystery, but the order of labor. Because a Kurgan does not give itself up with a single blow, and each layer speaks of people who created it knowing that anyone who would come later would first encounter earth, clay, stone, wood, the remains of what was meant to restrain time, and only then, if they did not break the logic, would they reach what preserves meaning. And it is precisely here that one very important thing enters the story, something that is often not felt immediately. A Scythian Kurgan is not a hiding place, but a model of the world, in which a person passes into another state as structurally as they lived. And therefore inside there is no chaos,
but an arrangement, where each object lies not nearby, but in its own place. And even when organic matter disappears, the place of the object continues to speak, because weapons, harness, vessels, and gold do not merely accompany the body, they build around it a space of status that must remain unchanged. Gold in this space appears not as a shining reward for a foreign eye, but as the final stroke of a system, as that which does not allow a roll to fall apart. And therefore, the first gold object that emerges from the earth usually does not look like a treasure in a fairy tale sense. It looks like a sign, with a form that immediately suggests where it was and what it did. It may be a thin plaque with an embossed animal once sewn onto clothing and functioning as a visible marker of belonging. It may be a fitting from a Goratos, where a scene of pursuit or tense struggle speaks not of decoration, but of discipline and right. It may be a detail of a belt set, where the repetition of a motif is not ornament, but a rhythm that keeps a person within the bounds of their function. Because a belt in steppe logic is not merely a strap, but a line that closes order on the body and makes it legible to one's own. And when you take such an object in your hands, a very simple but powerful thought arises. It was created not to please, it was created to signify. And in this signification is a precision that you feel even when you do not know all the rules. Because the animals on this gold are not cute and not ornamental, they are tense, as if compressed by inner movement. And it is precisely this tension, this compression of form, that the Scythians recognized as true strength, one that does not spread through words, but holds the boundary. Then the main thing begins to reveal itself. Gold in a Kurgan is not a single object, but a language laid out into phrases. And if you see individual words, plaques, fittings, pendants, harness elements, vessel details, sooner or later you encounter a sentence, and this sentence usually belongs not simply to a person, but to a person who embodied an entire layer of time, because it was precisely for such people that objects were made, in which gold not only fixed status, but showed how this status was inscribed into an understanding of the world. Here, the type of object becomes relevant that cannot be confused with everyday life, because its very construction says this was worn not for beauty, but as a sign of right and responsibility. And if before you is a large chest ornament with tiers of scenes, human order above, the movement of animals and forces in the middle, boundary and protection below, then you are seeing not a valuable item, but a model of the world, that a person wore on his chest as if carrying an obligation to hold this world in balance. And this is why such objects contain so many small details, because detail is not craftsmanship for craftsmanship's sake, but a way to make meaning so dense that it does not fall apart. But even when such large compositions are still far away, even when only fragments emerge from the earth, a very Scythian logic begins to appear. Gold does not belong to everyone, it belongs to roles, and the roles here differ not by wealth, but by function, because one object speaks of a warrior, another of an elder, a third of a person who seals an alliance, a fourth of a line of continuity held not only by the sword, but by the clan. And this is why female sets, when they appear in burials, do not look like female vanity. They often look like signs that close on the body, not beauty, but status. And through them it becomes visible. The clan in steppe civilization is not an abstraction, it has a form that can be worn. And the more the space of the Kurgan opens, the clearer it becomes that Scythian gold did not exist as a treasure in the ground. It existed as a continuation of an order that was first in life, then became ritual, and then became earth. And when the earth parts, it seems to release not objects, but fragments of another memory, one that does not ask for admiration, but demands respect for structure. And it is precisely here that the narrative enters the moment when a person looking at a Scythian sign begins involuntarily to read it, even without knowing letters, because the deer with folded legs ceases to be a deer and becomes movement. The animal ceases to be an animal and becomes a rule of tension. The griffin ceases to be fantasy and becomes the guardian of a boundary. And then it becomes clear why this civilization could exist without writing, but not without signs. They had texts. They simply were made not with ink, but with form. And gold was the material that allowed these texts to endure longer than the human voice.
When the first objects emerge from the earth and rest in the palm, it becomes clear that from this point on, the task is not to find more, but not to destroy what has already been found. Because the Scythian world did not preserve itself as a pile of objects, it preserved itself as a connected system. And if one knot is pulled out of that system without seeing what it is tied to, the object will remain gold, but it will cease to be a language, and thus lose the most important thing, the ability to tell who a person was and what exactly they held in their hands, within the clan, within the alliance, within the order that was never written in letters. That is why the gaze instinctively begins to seek not shine, but repetition, because repetition in Scythian gold is not ornament, it is grammar. And when the same animal appears several times on different objects, this does not mean that the craftsman liked carving deer. It means that the deer was a word used to speak about path, speed, the right to pass, and the right to lead. And if this deer stands on a belt plaque, it works closer to the body as a sign of status within the camp. But if it appears on an element of horse harness, it already works at a distance as a marker read in motion when a detachment gathers or approaches, and then it becomes visible that gold is distributed across the body and equipment, not for beauty, but so that a person's role is visible in any state, in rest, on campaign, in transition, in tension. That is why so often alongside gold plaques, pendants, and fittings, there appear things that at first glance seem simpler: belts, fasteners, buckles, plates, that is, objects that hold and lock. Because in steppe civilization, right does not hang in the air, it is always fixed. And when you see a belt set where metal elements are not chaotic, but form a sequence, you sense that the belt was not merely a place to carry a knife or pouch. It was a line separating a person from formlessness, and therefore gold on the belt meant not preciousness, but a boundary that makes status indisputable, as if saying, here the roll is closed, here the right begins. And that is why not everyone had the right to wear such things, because not everyone had the right to be recognized by the very first detail. And next to the belt, almost inevitably appears the goritos, the case for bow and arrows, because in Scythian logic, readiness is not a state for tomorrow, it is a form of life. And the goritos, especially if it bore gold fittings, carried not a picture, but a reminder of the rule within which the warrior exists, a scene of pursuit, a scene of struggle. A tense predator gripping its prey does not speak of cruelty, it speaks of discipline of the moment, of the fact that a weak form collapses in seconds, and that a person bearing the sign must be the one who holds form even when others lose it. Then another thing becomes noticeable, one that is easy to miss if you look only at the main objects, because Scythian gold speaks not only about war and not only about power, it speaks about continuity, which holds civilization longer than a single ruler, and that is why female sets, when they are revealed in burials, do not look accidental. They often carry the same logic of lock and boundary, only transferred into another form. Pendants, earrings, beads, Pectoral elements with thin plates and repeating motifs work as signs of a clan line that does not break. And if a certain form was permitted only to the elite, this was not about fashion, it was about right. Because in Scythian world, status is not proclaimed, it is worn, and therefore female gold can be no less authoritative than male gold. It simply fixes another type of strength, the strength of continuation, the strength of memory, the strength of right, transmitted not only through campaign, but through lineage. And here the narrative returns again to ritual, but not as a separate topic, rather as a fabric running through everything, because gold most often becomes visible precisely where everyday life passes into a moment that has consequences, and therefore in burials, alongside objects of power and war, there appears vesselware clearly not intended for daily use, because a cup, a fiali, or a raiton has a form that cannot be confused with a simple mug. And if such an object bears a gold rim or fitting, it means not love of beauty, but the need to fix an act that must last longer than those who performed it. For a Scythian agreement, a Scythian alliance, a Scythian brotherhood were not words in the air, they were actions that left a trace. And it is not accidental that scenes of communal drinking, of passing a vessel, of a close oath, of an equal gesture, when two or several people perform one action in one rhythm, appear on gold plates and ornaments, as if it was the shortest way to say, here was an alliance that cannot be broken lightly, because it is already written in metal. And if gold appears at all in such moments, it is only because what is being decided is not a trifle, but the structure of future movement. And then the Kurgan begins to read as a closed scene where all the main lines of Scythian life are gathered: power, war, continuity, alliance, transition. And gold in this scene works as what holds these lines together, preventing them from scattering into chaos, because gold does not fear time, but meaning fears randomness. And that is why Scythian civilization placed gold where randomness had to be excluded. And the longer you look at these objects, the less they resemble ornaments, and the more they resemble silent agreements, locks of status, seals of roles, schemes of the world that were worn on the body or placed beside it in the ground, as if saying, a person may depart, but their place in the order must not disappear. And if someone someday opens this ground, they will see not simply gold, but a form that holds memory, even when voices have long vanished. And it is from this moment that it becomes impossible to stop at a single Kurgan, because one revealed order inevitably reminds us that there were many such orders, that the steppe did not preserve one center, it preserved a network of points of memory, and each such point is not a repetition, but another variation of the same language, where some objects speak of a warrior, others of an elder, others of a woman of the clan, others of an alliance, others of the boundary between life and transition. And then understanding begins to move further, toward there where it is no longer only important what lies in the earth, but also why exactly these things lie this way, and what story they hold together. And this gradually leads to the moment when gold ceases to be a separate phenomenon and becomes proof that the civilization of the Ukraine steppe possessed its own complex internal system of knowledge, one that did not require writing because it wrote itself into form.
When there are more of these kurgans, when they begin to appear not as isolated points, but as a line stretched along routes, water, and crossings, another level of understanding gradually opens, because it becomes visible that the Scythian civilization did not merely live in the steppe, it thought of it as a space of memory, where every important place carried within it a trace of decisions, alliances, and turning points.
And that is why the Kurgans are not placed at random, but as if they mark a map that was never drawn, yet was well known. In this space, gold stops being tied to a single person and begins to work as a marker of time, because different layers of burials, different styles of images, and different levels of formal complexity speak not about fashion, but about changes in tension within the very world in which the Scythians lived. And if in one Kurgan, the animals on the gold are still restrained, almost geometric, while in another they are tense, broken, excessively expressive, this means not a change of taste, but a change in the conditions in which the civilization was forced to exist. So it gradually becomes clear that Scythian gold can be read as a chronicle without dates, where each image corresponds not to a year, but to a state of the world, and where a deer with widely spread legs speaks of a space that is still open and under control, while a predator with sharpened teeth and a taut body speaks of a world in which boundaries grow harder and error costs more. And it is precisely this shift of images that allows us to see how the Scythian civilization responded to challenges without leaving written testimony. This is especially evident in objects that belonged to the elite, because it is there that gold works at its highest density. And if at early stages the signs of power look restrained, as if they need no confirmation, then over time they become more complex, more layered, as if the world around them demands an ever clearer fixing of roles. And then compositions appear, where animals are no longer simply moving, but interacting, struggling, crossing, forming a complex web of tensions that a person wore on the body as a reminder of responsibility. In these images, it is important not to confuse complexity with decorativeness, because the Scythian master did not complicate form to impress. He complicated it when the world itself became more complex, and therefore every additional detail is not an ornament, but a clarification of meaning, as if the master is saying, now a simple sign is no longer enough. Now more is needed so that the role will be clear without words. That is why there are so many repetitions, mirrors, and symmetries in such objects, because symmetry here is not about beauty, it is about balance. And when two predators look at one another, or two animals lock their motion together, this is not a scene of battle, it is a scene of restraint, where neither side can destroy the other without losing equilibrium. And in this, one can easily recognize the worldview of a civilization that lived in a space of constant tension, but did not seek to break it. At this stage of the narrative, gold begins to reveal another property. It preserves not only what was, but also what was feared. Because fear in the Scythian world was not pushed away, it was woven into the system. And that is why alongside real animals, there appear fantastic beings, griffins, creatures with combined traits, guardians of boundaries that do not exist in nature, but exist in the imagination of the danger of transition. And these images are not fairy tale, they are disciplinary, because they remind there are boundaries that cannot be crossed without consequences. These fantastic figures appear especially often on objects connected with burials and transition, because it was there that the risk of disturbing the order was greatest. And gold again works as a material that fixes a warning, making it durable. And therefore a griffin on a gold plate is not an ornament, but a sentinel, placed not for the living, but for the transition itself. When you look at such objects together, it becomes clear that the Scythian civilization did not separate art from governance, religion from everyday life, or gold from life, because all these spheres were stitched into a single fabric. And if today we try to arrange them on separate shelves, it is only because we have lost the very logic of wholeness, in which an object cannot be simply beautiful, but is always functional in a broader sense.
And it is here that the narrative begins to return to the question of time, because it becomes obvious that a civilization that left no writing managed to leave something else, a rhythm readable through form. And this rhythm does not disappear even when particular names are erased, because gold preserves not names, but structure, and structure, unlike names, is capable of surviving centuries. So step by step, there emerges not merely the story of separate finds, but the story of how the civilization of the Ukrainian steppe spoke to itself through objects. And Scythian gold in this conversation was not the theme and not the finale, but one of the most precise ways to say, we were here, we knew who we were, and we left behind not chaos, but an order that can still be read for a long time if one looks closely.
When this picture comes together as a whole, another thing becomes visible, one that is difficult to notice from inside a single Kurgan, because it reveals itself only when the steppe is seen as an integral space, not as a collection of separate places. And then it becomes clear that the Scythian civilization thought not only in terms of time, but also in terms of distance, turning movement itself into a form of memory, where every route had not only a direction, but also a meaning. The paths along which the camps moved were not accidental, because they were repeated from generation to generation, and these repetitions created an invisible network in which every point knew to which others it was connected. And that is why gold found in different places so often speaks to one another through the same motifs, as if objects remembered not only their owner, but also the route along which that person moved, and the circle of people for whom this route was shared. In this sense, Scythian objects were never isolated, because even when they lay underground, they continued to belong to something larger. And if at one end of the steppe a motif appears that is repeated hundreds of kilometers away, this does not mean copying, but recognition, because a civilization is sustained not by uniformity, but by a shared understanding of what is considered proper and permissible. Here, gold once again acts not as a marker of wealth, but as a marker of connection, because its durability allows us to see what organic materials have long since lost. And when today we observe similar forms on different objects, we are in fact seeing not a style, but the trace of an agreement that operated across great distances and kept people within a single order, without the need for centralized authority. This is especially noticeable in objects connected with movement, because horse harness, elements of tack, details of saddles and breastplates often carry the same signs as belt sets or pectoral ornaments, as if the person and the horse formed a single figure moving through space not by chance, but as a bearer of a specific role. And gold here works as a point of fixation of that role in motion. In such a world, space was not empty, because every area had its own history of use, its own dangers, and its own possibilities. And the Scythians knew well where one could stop for a long time and where only to rest briefly, where it was necessary to keep watch and where relaxation was permitted. And this knowledge was not written down because it was transmitted through experience and through signs that helped one navigate without words. That is why Kurgans so often stand in visible places, not hiding in lowlands, because they served not only as places of memory, but also as points of orientation, and the gold hidden inside was like the heart of that marker, fixing the meaning of a place even when people temporarily disappeared from these lands. And in this system of markers, gold was not the main element, but it was the most reliable, because it did not rot, did not break, and did not disappear as quickly as wood or leather. And therefore, it is through gold that the sense has reached us that the steppe was inhabited, not by random nomads, but by people who had a clear understanding of where they were and where they were moving.
When one looks at this from a distance, it becomes clear that the Scythian civilization did not seek to fix itself in the form of an empire, because an empire requires a center and borders, and steppe logic recognizes neither. And instead, it created another kind of stability, through repeated movement, through a network of connections, through signs that maintained order without the need for coercion. Gold in this system was not a universal key, but it was a reliable knot, because it allowed to secure what could not be left to chance, and that is why we see it where power, alliance, transition, and memory are involved, but almost never see it where life followed its ordinary course. And the more this logic unfolds, the less accidental individual finds become, because they begin to form a narrative not about lost gold, but about a lost system of thinking, in which space, movement, and sign formed a single whole. And it was precisely this whole that allowed the civilization of the Ukrainian steppe to exist for a long time without collapsing under the pressure of change. Thus, the narrative gradually moves beyond individual objects and even beyond individual people, because gold here is only a guide that allows us to see something far greater, a way of life in which memory was not stored in archives but moved together with people, and where every sign had meaning only because it was part of a living, constantly renewed order. When this order held for a long enough time, it began to function without constant confirmation, because a person born inside the Scythian world from the earliest years saw not explanations, but examples, and through them understood what was permitted, what was forbidden, and what one would have to answer for. And in this environment, gold was not a teaching tool, but a result, reached only after a long path. A child did not receive signs immediately, because a sign without experience means nothing. And so at first, the child learned to observe, to notice the difference between those who had the right to wear certain objects and those who had not yet reached that moment. And in this way, an understanding gradually formed that the world is not equal, but ordered, and that this order does not humiliate, but distributes responsibility. The first personal objects were simple, and there was no gold in them, because they served the body, not status. And only later, when a person passed tests that did not require witnesses, did the possibility appear to receive a sign that spoke no longer of age, but of place. And this transition was never sudden, because it was prepared for years. That is why Scythian gold so often appears mature, deprived of frivolity, because it was not intended to display youth or strength that had not yet been tested. And the masters knew this well, creating objects without excessive play of form, but with an inner tension that is felt even when the context is unknown. In this tension, symmetry and repetition played an important role, because repetition in Scythian logic meant not decoration, but stability. And if identical figures appeared on an object, this meant that the person maintained balance, did not deviate, and did not try to stand out by breaking the rule. And such restraint was considered a sign of strength. Gold here seemed to teach silently, because the one who wore it constantly felt the weight of the object, and this weight reminded that right always presses, even when it is not visible from the outside, and that removing an ornament does not mean removing an obligation, because the obligation is already fixed in the memory of the clan. This is especially evident in how the Scythians treated violations, because breaking the order was not always punished immediately, and often the heaviest punishment was the removal of a sign or the prohibition to wear it further, because in such a world, this meant the loss of one's place, and to lose one's place among his own was harder than to endure physical pain. And conversely, the return of a sign or the granting of a new one meant that the person was once again included in the system, and gold here performed the function of visible confirmation that trust had been restored, and that is why such moments were remembered more strongly than any words. Over time, this mechanism made the civilization resistant to internal shocks, because even when individual people disappeared, the order remained, and new generations entered it without the need to invent everything anew. And gold in this process was not a driving force, but an anchor that prevented what had already been tested from shifting. When external pressure intensified and the surrounding world changed faster than before, it was precisely this internal discipline that allowed the Scythians not to dissolve immediately, because they held not to forms, but to meanings, and if a form stopped working, it could be changed without losing the essence. And therefore, looking at these objects today, we see not merely craftsmanship or aesthetics, but the result of a long education of a civilization in which gold did not educate people, but showed who had already been educated. And in this, perhaps, lies one of the reasons why these signs are still felt to be stronger than many later symbols. Thus, the history of Scythian gold gradually moves from objects to people, and from people to a way of thinking, in which a sign never precedes action, and memory is never separated from responsibility. And it is this that makes this civilization not merely past, but understandable even across centuries. Over time, this system began to manifest itself not only inside the camp or the clan, but also in the way the Scythian world left traces behind. Because they did not try to speak directly to the future, did not leave messages, and did not build monuments for descendants, yet everything they did correctly itself became a message that could be read if one knew the language of signs. In this sense, burial mounds were not points of completion, but nodes of memory, because life continued around them. Roots changed, but the mounds themselves remained landmarks, and people passing by knew not only that someone important was buried here, but also why this place could not be ignored, because memory in the steppe worked as part of space. The gold that remained inside these mounds was not deliberately hidden from the world. It simply passed into another state, from an active sign in everyday life to a fixed image of order. And this transition was not considered a loss, because the meaning of an object did not disappear with its bearer, but remained inscribed in the earth. That is why an archaeologist who opens a mound actually enters not a treasury, but a closed system, where every object lies not where it is convenient, but where it has meaning. And if the place of even one object is changed, the logic of the whole is broken, and this logic is readable even when nothing organic remains. Golden objects in such complexes rarely exist on their own, because they always converse with weapons, horse harness, vessels, the body. And it is precisely in this interaction that it becomes clear that what we see is not wealth, but role, not ornament, but function, not a random set, but a structure transferred from life into memory. This is especially evident where gold repeats motifs that we have already seen on living people, the same animals, the same poses, the same tension of movement, as if the world does not change with death, but only stops in one phase in order to remain recognizable on the other side. There is no fear of non-being in this, because the Scythian model of the world did not require the denial of death. It simply did not consider it a rupture, and therefore gold did not protect a person from disappearance, but helped them preserve form in another state, just as in life it helped to preserve the form of order amid movement. And when we look at these objects today in isolation, in museums, display cases, catalogs, they may seem silent, but it is enough to imagine them in place, in connection with body, space, and action for them to begin to work again, because their language does not depend on time, it depends on context. It is for this reason that the Scythian civilization does not dissolve into general antiquity, because it left behind not only objects, but a way of thinking in which a sign is always linked to responsibility and beauty to function, and gold here is only the most visible but not the only carrier of this approach. Thus, the story gradually moves beyond the bounds of a single people and begins to sound broader, because it speaks not about the exoticism of the steppe, but about the possibility of the existence of a complex order without writing, without stone, and without coercion. And in this sense, the Scythian world becomes not an exception, but an alternative that we are only now beginning to truly understand. And the more attentively we read these signs, the clearer it becomes that Scythian gold is not a memory of lost splendor, but the trace of a civilization that knew how to leave behind not noise, but form, capable of enduring for centuries without the need for explanations.
From this point of understanding, another thing becomes visible, one that went unnoticed for a long time because people were accustomed to seeing the Scythians either as warriors or as nomads, but rarely as carriers of knowledge, even though the very structure of their life shows that knowledge here was not preserved in text, but lived in repetition, in the precision of actions, and in the correct use of signs. Gold in this system played the role of a fixer of knowledge, but not abstract knowledge, rather practical knowledge, because it appeared precisely where an action had to be carried out without error. And that is why the most complex golden objects are always connected with moments of transition, of power, of age, of alliance, or of death, when a wrong step could disturb the balance not of one person, but of an entire clan. When we see repeated scenes on gold plates, care for animals, preparation for a journey, the clash of beasts, these are not everyday pictures and not decoration for the eye, but preserved algorithms of behavior, where every pose and every movement has already passed the test of time and is therefore considered correct. In such a world, knowledge was not transmitted in the form of explanations, because explanations can always be distorted, but correct form cannot. And that is why the younger learned not from the elder's speech, but from how he moved, how he held an object, how he arranged things around himself. And gold here was a prompt that could not be ignored. This is especially clear in complex pectoral and belt compositions, where the order of elements is not changed accidentally, because top, middle, and bottom correspond to different levels of action, and a person who wore such an object literally carried a map of the world on their body, in which it was clear where the place of the human is, where the place of force is, and where the boundary lies that should not be crossed without necessity. Such knowledge did not require separate custodians, because it was distributed throughout the entire community, and everyone who had the right to a sign simultaneously bore responsibility for maintaining order, while gold merely helped to prevent the form of this order from being lost under conditions of constant movement. That is why the Scythian civilization could exist for a long time without writing, because its memory was not fragile. It did not depend on a carrier who could disappear, and it was not tied to a single place, but lived in the body, in gesture, in object, in the rhythm of actions that were repeated from generation to generation without loss of meaning. When such a world encountered other cultures, it did not dissolve, because it had an internal framework, and even if the external form changed, new techniques appeared, other materials, the internal logic remained unchanged, and gold continued to perform its role as a bearer of verified knowledge. This makes the Scythian legacy more complex than simply nomadic,
because it shows a model of civilization in which knowledge is not separated from life, is not stored apart, and does not require a special place, but exists only as long as people act correctly in the world. And when we look at these objects today, we are in fact seeing frozen fragments of thinking that was not meant to be preserved for us, yet turned out to be precise enough to survive centuries and remain readable even without translation. Thus, Scythian gold gradually ceases to be a mystery and becomes evidence that knowledge can live not in words, but in form, and that a civilization can exist without archives if it knows how to fix meaning in actions that require no commentary.
And when you look at this heritage as a whole, it becomes clear that the Scythian world did not seek to remain in memory as a completed story, because it did not think of itself as completed. And that is precisely why its traces do not form a line with a beginning and an end, but rather a network where individual nodes are connected not by time, but by meaning. This network did not rest on a single center, because in steppe logic, a center is always a temporary place, and therefore even the most important Kurgans did not create a capital, but only strengthened directions of movement, which remained relevant as long as people remembered how to use them. Gold in such a system was not concentrated in one place, because concentration would have meant stagnation, and stagnation in the steppe quickly becomes danger, and therefore signs were distributed together with responsibility, passing from some to others at moments when order required it. This is clearly visible in the difference between objects created for life and those that went into the ground, because the former had to be convenient, light, and suitable for movement, while the latter could be more complex, heavier, richer in images, as if all the excess of meaning that could not be carried every day was gathered at a point of memory. In this way, a peculiar balance arose between the living and the fixed, where gold did not overload everyday life, but did not disappear from it completely either, remaining present enough for order not to fall apart, yet not becoming a burden. In this, one can see a particular attitude toward time, because for the Scythians, what mattered was not what would remain, but what works. And if a sign ceased to work, it could be changed, remelted, or passed to another, without being considered a loss, because meaning lives not in form, but in the correct use of form. That is why many gold objects bear traces of reworking, refinement, the combination of different elements, and this is not a sign of poverty or randomness, but on the contrary, evidence of a living process in which form constantly adjusts to action without losing the language of images. When this world began to collide with the pressure of other orders, more rigid, more fixed in stone and writing, it did not disappear instantly, because its flexibility allowed it to preserve integrity for a long time, even when external circumstances changed faster than the habitual rhythm of life. Gold played its role here as well, because it preserved old codes even when new influences tried to impose others. And it is precisely thanks to this that today we can see not only the result of cultural mixing, but also a line of continuity that does not break but transforms. This transformation was not always visible to an external eye, because it took place not in demonstrative gestures, but in small changes of form, in the choice of subject, in what was retained and what was discarded. And that is why the Scythian world cannot be understood through a single object or a single find. It reveals itself only when one begins to see the connections between things, between places, between recurring motifs that do not shout about themselves, but stubbornly return again and again, as if reminding us that order can be quiet, yet enduring. And the longer this gaze lasts, the clearer it becomes that the Scythian civilization did not vanish suddenly. It simply ceased to be visible in the form familiar to us, leaving behind not ruins, but a way of thinking that can still be read in gold today, if one does not hurry and does not look for nothing but shine. When this way of thinking gradually comes to the foreground, it becomes clear why the Scythian world is so difficult to fit into simple schemes, because it did not build itself around an event, a date, or a name, but around the ability to maintain balance between movement and form. And it was precisely this ability that allowed the civilization to exist where others required walls, writing, and constant fixation. Gold, in this context, ceases to be the central character and becomes rather a marker of quality, because it appears not everywhere, but only where order reached maximum tension and required a material capable of withstanding that tension without distortion. And therefore, every genuine golden object in the Scythian world is an answer to a specific necessity, not to a desire to decorate life. This is clearly visible in how the Scythians treated excess, because excess for them was not a sign of prosperity, but a threat, and objects that did not work, did not secure meaning, or did not support structure had no right to remain for long, regardless of the material from which they were made. That is why gold did not accumulate uncontrollably, did not pass into the category of treasure, but constantly circulated, changing form, function, and bearer, as if passing through the same cycles as the people who used it. And there was no chaos in this circulation, because every transition had a reason. When a certain sign lost its relevance, it was not destroyed out of respect for the material, but it was not preserved out of sentiment either, because memory for the Scythians was not attached to the object itself. It lived in the correct moment of its use, and gold simply helped to fix that moment. In this sense, the Scythian world was extremely pragmatic, but this pragmatism did not negate complexity, because complexity lay not in the number of things, but in the precision of their application. And that is why even a single golden detail could carry greater weight than an entire set of objects devoid of meaning. When this civilization gradually lost space for its habitual movement, it did not collapse immediately, because its foundation lay not in territory, but in the order of actions. And even while changing routes, alliances, or external forms, the Scythian world retained its internal logic for a long time. Gold remained a witness here as well, because it best preserves not only form, but also traces of use, and scratches, wear, and repairs on golden objects often say more than a perfect surface, because they show that the object lived, worked, and changed together with people. Thus, gradually, an image emerges of a civilization that did not seek eternity as immobility, but achieved it through movement, did not try to inscribe itself for the future, yet remained readable because it knew how to fix meaning where it was truly necessary. And the further we go along this path of understanding, the more obvious it becomes that Scythian gold is not a memory of luxury, but a memory of the discipline of meaning, of a world in which every object had the right to exist only as long as it supported order. And that is why this world left behind not a chaos of fragments, but a recognizable, stable form of presence.
And when this form of presence emerges fully, it becomes clear that the Scythian world cannot be considered vanished in the usual sense, because it did not dissolve and was not destroyed, but rather completed one mode of existence, transferring its inner framework into the earth, into signs, into the silent structure of things that continued to work already without people. Gold in this final dimension ceases to be even a marker of status or transition and becomes a witness that a civilization can end with dignity without leaving behind emptiness, because emptiness arises where there is no order, and here order was so woven into life that it required no further support. The Kurgans, which over time merged with the landscape, did not disappear from the memory of space because they were not alien objects, and that is why the steppe accepted them without resistance, making them part of itself, rather than ruins that constantly remind of loss. The golden objects that remained inside did not wait to be discovered because waiting was not part of Scythian thinking, and their presence in the earth was not a pause but a continuation of function, to preserve the form of order where life had moved into another state. That is why the moment of finding such objects in our time often looks like an unexpected encounter rather than a discovery, because we encounter not the past, but a system that simply had no addressee for a long time capable of reading it. And when we try to understand this civilization through its gold, we are in fact testing ourselves, because the question is no longer what these objects meant to the Scythians, but whether we today are capable of perceiving meaning without explanations, of reading form without text, and of seeing order where there are no familiar supports. The Scythian world left us no instructions, but left an example in which the complex can exist without excess, power without separation from life, memory without writing, and beauty without ostentation, and it is precisely in this that its quiet strength lies. Gold in this story does not shine and does not seduce. It holds, fixes, does not allow disintegration, and if one looks at it without haste, it becomes clear that it was never a goal, it was a tool that allowed the civilization to live its time fully. Thus, the story does not end with a full stop, because the Scythian world left no finale, it left a state in which order is possible without words, and this state is still present in the steppe, in the earth, in the signs that require no translation. And if one listens to this story attentively, without expecting loud conclusions, it does not fall asleep with the night, but remains nearby, reminding us that a civilization can disappear from the surface, yet not disappear from the structure of the world, if it was built with precision.